Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the dramatic and, frankly, chaotic final chapter of Alexander the Great's conquests. We are going to trace the rapid collapse of his absolutely legendary empire. It's a crazy story of unmatched tactical brilliance, profound human limitation, and ultimately, total political devastation. Right off the bat, we really have to ask ourselves a pretty incredible question. How could a military genius, a king who literally conquered the known world, be brought to a dead halt? Not by a massive, superior army, mind you, but by the sheer, unadulterated exhaustion of his very own men. To wrap our heads around this tragedy, we're going to hit 4 key points. First, Alexander at India's gates. Second, his masterclass at the Hydaspes. Third, the moment the army says no. And finally, how the empire shatters. Let's get right into it. Kicking things off with Section 1, Alexander at India's gates and the clash of civilizations. Our story begins in the year 326 BC. Alexander's insatiable ambition has dragged him all the way to the western banks of the swollen Hydaspes River, which we know today as the Jhelum River, and it's here that he comes face to face with King Porus and a fierce, entirely unfamiliar style of Indian warfare. Now, just picture this terrifying mismatch for the invaders. On one side, you have the ultra-disciplined Macedonian phalanx, soldiers locked tightly in formation, wielding massive 6-meter-long pikes called sarissas. But on the other side, you have the sheer brute force of King Porus's towering war elephants. For the Macedonian horses and the men themselves, the size, the smell, and the sheer noise of these heavily armored beasts was a literal nightmare scenario. Moving into Section 2, Masterclass at the Hydaspes, focusing on his tactical brilliance. Facing down a heavily fortified enemy across a raging, monsoon-swollen river, Alexander was in a seriously tight spot. A direct frontal crossing? That would have been absolute suicide. So instead, he delivers what is arguably the greatest tactical masterclass of his entire military career. The sheer cunning he used here is just mind-blowing. It was a masterclass in psychological deception. For weeks, he marched his troops loudly up and down his side of the riverbank, shouting battle cries. King Porus naturally mirrored these movements, until his men eventually just grew fatigued and lax. They got completely conditioned to the false alarms. Then, under the cover of a violent midnight thunderstorm, Alexander secretly moved a strike force 27 kilometers upstream and crossed those raging waters entirely undetected. But once the battle finally joined, Alexander knew he was still in a really tough spot. His infantry was outnumbered almost 3-1 by Porus's massive force, so he had to get creative. He strategically delayed the frontal clash, holding his phalanx back just long enough to allow his superior cavalry to organize this complex, sweeping envelopment maneuver. It completely forced Porus into a defensive panic. And a huge piece of this puzzle was his Scythian horse archers. Porus had deployed these deadly chariots, but the heavy rain from the night before had turned the battlefield into this soft, muddy mess. By sending in his highly mobile horse archers to harass the right flank, Alexander completely neutralized those chariots. Their wheels became hopelessly bogged down in the mud, basically turning them into sitting ducks. So the battle rages for 7 grueling hours, and ultimately, Alexander's forces encircle the elephants and annihilate the Indian army. But here is the wild part. Despite this crushing victory, Alexander was so deeply impressed by the captured Porus, who, by the way, fought bravely on his elephant until he was severely wounded, that when Porus demanded to be treated as a king would treat another king, Alexander actually agreed. He let his former enemy keep his territory and subjects as an ally. Just incredible respect between rivals. Which brings us to Section 3, The Army Says No, detailing the infamous Hyphaesis Mutiny. Now, you would think an unbelievable victory like that would fire the guys up, right? Pushing them to keep going? Actually, the opposite happened. Immediately following this tactical peak, the Macedonians hit an absolute physical and psychological wall at the river Hyphaesis. They flat out refused to march even one step further east. Let's get real about what it was actually like for these guys on the ground. This was not cowardice. It was the absolute limit of human endurance. Imagine their suffering. They had endured 8 relentless years of combat across thousands of miles. They had just suffered through 70 straight days of nonstop torrential monsoon rain. 70 days. Their horses' hooves were quite literally worn down to the bone. Their traditional Greek armor had completely rotted away in the jungle humidity, which forced them to wear recut Indian rags just to survive. They were utterly, completely spent. Homesick doesn't even begin to cover it. The ancient historian Arrian really hit the nail on the head with this quote. He paints a picture of an army that was literally running on fumes. They simply could not match the boundless, almost manic energy of their commander anymore. Alexander looked at the world as this endless map just waiting to be colored in. But his men, they just saw endless danger, and they desperately wanted to see their families again. It sets up this incredible clash of perspectives when Alexander finally calls a meeting. Alexander pleads with them, appealing to this mythological ambition to outdo the gods Heracles and Dionysus, promising them a universal empire all the way to the Eastern Sea. But his general, Conus, steps forward to speak for the men. And Conus delivers this desperate, incredibly grounded plea. He basically begs Alexander to let the surviving veterans go home, warning him not to push their luck and lose absolutely everything to one sudden turn of bad fortune. While the army goes wild cheering for Coquinus, and Alexander, he is furious. He feels completely betrayed by his own men, so he retreats into his tent and literally sulks for 3 full days. 3 days, just waiting for them to cave and change their minds. But the silence from the camp was deafening. Finally, realizing he's beat, he concedes defeat to his own army. To save face, he claims the religious omens were unfavorable to advance, orders the construction of 12 massive altars, and they finally turn back. And that leads us right into Section 4, the Empire Shatters and the Wars of the Diadochi. This is our final tragic chapter. Because the crazy truth is, Alexander never made it back to Macedon. Just a few short years later, in 323 BC, he died suddenly in Babylon at the age of just 32. And because he left absolutely no clear heir, his leaderless, totally exhausted empire was plunged instantly into absolute chaos. Since there was zero succession plan in place, we see immediate geopolitical fragmentation. Alexander's top generals, known as the Diadochi, or the successors, ruthlessly carved up the known world during the partition of Babylon. As we map it out here, you see Ptolemy grabbing Egypt, Seleucus taking the wealthy eastern territories of Babylonia and Persia, Antigonus holding Phrygia and Asia Minor, Cassander seizing Macedon and Greece, and Lysimachus taking Thrace. And shocker, they didn't stay friendly neighbors for very long. What followed was a brutal, relentless succession of civil wars that dragged on for decades. Think about it. Former brothers in arms, men who had bled together under Alexander across Persia and India, were now slaughtering each other just to claim the scraps of a fragmented global empire. It was a dizzying era of shifting alliances, backstabbing betrayals, and massive, bloody battles spanning all the way from Greece to Babylon. Which leaves us with this final, pretty heavy thought. It's the ultimate historical irony, really. What is the actual value of conquering the entire known world, of pushing human endurance to its absolute breaking point, if a total lack of succession planning ensures your life's work immediately drowns in blood the second you're gone? Alexander won every single battle he ever fought, but in the end, he couldn't conquer human nature, and he couldn't conquer time. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.